Thank you very much for inviting me to respond to a couple of intangible things. And I'm not going to talk for very long because you don't need a lecture. You're probably all very familiar with theoretical ideas and being practitioners yourself. Maybe you're bouncing your own ideas off what you've already seen and heard anyway. I want to make a few comments then. There were observations really while I was hearing the first gig, the safe gig, because and they're not necessarily about the safe gig, they're probably about what goes on with noise anyway, with music that's beyond the normal vocabulary of music. Noise is about disruption. It's about disruption of narrative. It's about avoidance of structure to some degree, or at least in an internal way. And it's an emphasis on, in practice, it provides an emphasis on texture and on the sort of things which are thrown away, the sort of things specifically which we consider as unmusical. So when someone makes a recording of a musical band, but what they want to take out are the glitches and the white noise and the overtones that aren't intended. So this is a focus on the things which is in a way the opposite of the aesthetic that most music goes along with. If you like, of technology. It's using technology in the wrong way. It's fucking with things. It's fucking with the rules and seeing what happens. There's an experimental element in that you don't know exactly what the outcome's going to be. It's indeterminate to some extent. So, I guess what I'm wanting to ask is, what does that kind of music intend to do? And in an aesthetic and a political way, what does it intend to do? And also, because my background is in anthropology of music, what does it do with the people who listen to it? What kind of practices are constructed around music making and music listening? So, first of all, noise is about interference, it's about detritus, it's about stuff that doesn't get used. So we're negating, in listening to noise, the focus on consonance, which is the most powerful discourse about music. Harmony and consonance, at least until the start of the last century. It's foregrounding parts that we filter out. It's taking the bits that we want to suppress and bringing them to the foreground. Also, in terms of noise, people like Atali have talked about noise as being something political. As being a kind of gesture of alienation. So it's a reaction to this dominant discourse, if you It's saying, fuck that, here's some noise, here we're using the same kind of, we're negating that vocabulary. So in a sense, noise only exists in relation to the sense of consonance. It has to be the other of something which is understood. So this is why, for example, if you go to North Africa, where I do research, people can't stand anything noisy. Because in North Africa, noise is associated with things rural and feminine and dangerous and sexual and difficult. It's that those kind of textures are threatening. What is seen as civilized and intellectual is pure tone, microtone, rule and order, and not an ecstatic response to sound in that kind of visceral way. So there's a kind of moral hierarchy in response to sound, which is quite different to the West, where this is part of a kind of negotiation of aesthetics. Atali, as you probably know, faces some of this sort of friction between structure and anti-structure on Nietzsche's ideas, with Dionysian and Apollonian, structure against noise in some regards, which is intellect against the body. Okay, wonderful. Now, getting to the particular performance, the first performance, the use of the story, the use of the narrative there was quite a great way of illustrating what's going on there, because there's a sort of a relishing in the decay of a story. It's denying a narrative. There's a story which we hear the start of, and then it's reverberated, it's fractured. We never hear what the story is. The story itself, actually, because I read it, not because I heard it, is a kind of reveling in decay. It's a reveling in dissonance, a breakdown of structure. So on a gestural level as well as on a literal level, it's about a pleasure in destruction. Finding there's an aesthetic in the breaking down of order there. Is this radical? No, of course it's not radical. It's not as a concept. It's radical in its performance, because we're looking actually in a performance not for a radical idea. We're looking for the subtlety, and we're looking for the nuanced performance and an exhibition of taste in what people are doing. So even though it's negating certain discourses, it is still in a sense complying with those same discourses. It's not radical in a political sense. It's occupying space, but it's occupying a contained space with blinds drawn and lights down. It's a ritual space. It's not a space of contention. If it was a space of contention, you wouldn't have an invited audience, or you'd invite different people. So there's a limit to how much this could be seen as a radical political thing. And the anti-aesthetic, the anti-art aesthetic is as old as, certainly as old as Duchamp in terms of the visual arts and Rousseau in terms of the sound arts. So this isn't a new idea. What else did I say about that? Yes. So, if you look at the performance, we are valuing, when we're reading whether this is a good performance or not. I mean, these aren't recordings. There's an aesthetic which we understand, and kind of, Howard Becker's art world kind of sense of sharing cultural meanings and being able to read things in a certain way. And so we understand the aesthetic nuances of what people are doing. We're watching people on stage, and they may be using detritus. They may be using stuff that we've rejected, abjected material. But we're still listening to it, and we're still on one side of a stage to performers. There's a power relationship there between performer and audience, which is precisely the same as if we were watching a string quartet play Bach. There's no difference in that kind of context. What is different is the aesthetic. We're still listening for differences in colour and texture, timing, interaction. Those are exactly the same kind of things that we'd be looking for in an improvised genre of any kind of music. And it reminds, so where is the pleasure? Now, it reminds me actually when I was a kid, I was about 13. I was a great Slade fan, as I'm sure everybody was. And you were born. I had a great pleasure in playing Slade records, and we had this little downset thing with only one speaker, and it was pretty powerless, you know. But you could turn the fucking thing up, and you could stick your ear right next to it. And I used to lie there with this thing blasting in one ear, distorting horribly. I couldn't even hear what Slade was. I could hear there was a physical presence of the sound, and I could hear all these overtones that Slade had never imagined, and ricocheting around my head. And I got enormous pleasure from the physicality of it, from the in a way the unpredictability of it, and the way it diverged from what the intention of the author, if you like, was about. So and this grew onto a kind of a sort of sad fascination with the Velvet Underground and Faust and all those sort of groups that sort of went or twisted somewhat the aesthetic. So there was an element of distortion, and also in overstimulation. The sheer volume itself is an important aspect of the music, which I came to appreciate. And I appreciated it in a non-intellectual way. It was a very physical, visceral way. And the way that explains this best to me was Barth's ideas of the grain in the voice that he talks about. That it's not necessarily the text or the narrative that conveys the meaning, it's the fact that Frank Sinatra has a certain kind of voice, with certain kind of distinct overtones. That Jacques Brel sort of is spit and phlegm as he's speaking. That there's a sort of, there's all sorts of things going on there beyond the surface level of the text. And I think I came to appreciate that kind of aesthetic, on my own in a sad bedroom, but you eventually find other sufferers and form a kind of self-help group, So there's Barth's ideas actually, I think, are quite useful, because he talks about this grain, this sort of substance to sound, which isn't in the shape of it, which isn't in the narrative or the structures. And this actually fits in quite well with psychological theories, which talk about the cerebral cortex doing all the dealing with structures, dealing with language, dealing with mathematics, the gestalt of music. But actually, the textures, the tones and the overtones are processed in a different part of the brain, in the limbic region, an area we share with dinosaurs and chickens and sheep, which, evolution, it's a very old evolutionary part of the brain, which recognises mate, it recognises our species from another species, it recognises male from female, breeding season, it recognises, it's an imprinting part of the brain, which is very close to your adrenal gland. It's very close to the pituitary gland. It's very close to the places where you're physically mobilized into emotion, sexual emotion, fear, terror, all those sort of things. And they don't work in the part of the brain that juggles digits and looks for shapes. So when you're talking about music which is based on texture, whether you call it music or you don't, you are talking about responding to it in a much more visceral way than you would be when you're talking about interlocking structures, which is a more of an intellectual, conscious process. This is, you know, the mystery of music, because people can't understand why music moves them. And of course there's memory and there's all sorts of experiences which explain that to some extent. But it's also because it works on parts of the brain which don't even talk to each other. One is to do with words, and one is to do with sensation. It's to do with sensuality. So there's an aesthetic dialogue going on there. Blah, 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 blah. Where did I go yet? Oh yeah, I talked something about the pleasure of the grit in the Vaseline, whatever that means. It meant something when I wrote it.
Getting a bit too subjective.
Yeah, well, all right, okay, you can picture it. But and again, you know, this is concentrating on one aspect of music rather than others. It's not inventing a new part of music, it's refocusing something.